Hello and welcome back to the Bookshelf Odyssey and our deep dive into Dickens. We are studying Great Expectations, and today's chapters we're covering will be parts 9 and 10 that cover chapters 14, 15, 16, and 17. Thank you everyone for just bearing with me as we missed last week. We had the flu coming through our house and just not suitable for recording. So I appreciate you all hanging in there with me. So tonight we are back at it. If you're following along on the schedule, everything just gets pushed back a week. I should have the new schedule in the comments below so you can check that out. But today we have a lot of ground to cover in these chapters. They were phenomenally rich and detailed in moving the plot along. So where we left off with Pip, he was given money from Miss Havisham to be apprenticed to Joe. Everybody is celebrating that except for Pip. He's rather depressed because he wants to be a gentleman and he wants to be rich and he wants to be with Estella. And none of these things seem like they will be coming to pass for him. And he ends chapter 13 feeling very wretched about his life. These sections that come, Pip's character really changes, and I think he becomes a very unlikable character for a while, at least in these sections in these chapters, because he's moaning and he's complaining about what he doesn't have rather than paying attention to what he does have. But let's go ahead and just get going on these chapters. We've got a lot to cover tonight. And so get your copy of Great Expectations, get your favorite cup of tea, and let's dive in to Dickens. So chapter 14 and 15 begin part 9, our part 9. Pip is again talking about how he's ashamed of home. The chapter 14 begins, he says, "It is a most miserable thing to feel ashamed of home. There may be black ingratitude in the thing, and the punishment may be retributive and well-deserved, but that is a miserable thing, I can testify. Home had never been a very pleasant place to me because of my sister's temper, but Joe had sanctified it, and I believed in it. I had believed in the best parlor as a most elegant salon. I had believed in the front door as a mysterious portal of the temple of state, whose solemn opening was attended with a sacrifice of roast fowls. I had believed in the kitchen as a chaste. I had believed in the forge as the glowing road to manhood and independence. Within a single year, all that was changed. Now it was all coarse and common, and I would not have had Miss Havisham and Estella see it on any account." So chapter 14 starts with Pip commenting about his change in perspective and how just a year has gone by and everything about his thoughts about home have completely changed. You know, I know we've talked about in the comments about how those words of cruelty that Estella used, and the whole situation has stirred up all of these thoughts of dissatisfaction in Pip, where he could have lived a very simple and happy life, but he is now longing for something he doesn't have, and he wants it more than anything. So chapter 14 is very brief. He is just talking about how miserable he feels and how dissatisfied he is, but that he would never tell Joe about that. And he said about midway through this chapter, he says, "I was quite as dejected on the first working day of my apprenticeship as in that aftertime, but I am glad to know that I never breathed a murmur to Joe while my indentures lasted. It is about the only thing I am glad to know of myself in that connection." So what a statement. He didn't tell Joe he was dissatisfied, and he says, looking back at himself, that it's about the only thing I was glad that he was glad to know about himself at that time. So I think maybe even the older Pip is a little disgusted with his behavior here and in these chapters. That was my understanding of that. So let me know what you think there. He goes on to say that for though it includes what I proceed to add, all the merit of what I proceed to add was Joe's. It was not because I was faithful, but because Joe was faithful, that I never ran away and went for a soldier or a sailor. It was not because I had a strong sense of the virtue of industry, but because Joe had a strong sense of the virtue of industry, that I worked with tolerable zeal against the grain. It is not possible to know how far the influence of any amiable, honest-hearted, duty-doing man flies out into the world, but it is very possible to know how it has touched oneself in going by. And I know right well that any good that intermixed itself with my apprenticeship came of plain contented Joe, and not of restless, aspiring, discontented me. So he puts any good thing that he has become, any goodness that he has, any faithfulness that he's shown, any hard work that he's demonstrated, he says it's because of Joe's influence in his life. That's going to be something we're going to want to pay attention to as the chapters unfold. And that's all I'll say about that. But Joe has had a profound influence on him. And he said without Joe, he would have run off because, and to be fair, home was unpleasant to him, very unpleasant. Yet Joe made it pleasant. And I love that, how acts of kindness and compassion and empathy can make even a terrible home, or let's put it this way, a terrible house into a home. So he's haunted by visions of Estella still. And at the final paragraph of chapter 4, he would have these visions of Estella still. And after those visions, he would see her, that just when maybe he was getting satisfied with his work, he'd remember Estella. It says, after that, when we went into supper, the place in the meal would have a more homely look than ever, and I would feel more ashamed of home than ever in my own ungracious breast. So his older self here is acknowledging that his younger self, that this was very ungracious of him to think this way, and that this is not good. This is not right. So we get to chapter 15, and we find out that Pip pretty much learns everything he's going to be able to learn from Mr. Wopsel's great aunt, but Biddy continues to teach him because Biddy is a wonderful person, and we don't deserve her. But she continues to teach him. And the things that Biddy tries to teach Pip, Pip then goes to try to teach Joe. As we find here on this first page of chapter 15, a very proud, awful statement that Pip makes. He says, "Whatever I acquired, I tried to impart to Joe. This statement sounds so well that I cannot in my conscience let it pass unexplained. I wanted to make Joe less ignorant and common, that he might be worthier of my society and less open to Estella's reproach." And now here we begin to see Pip's character really begin to change. We see a lot of pride in him, I think. But what a terrible thing to say. If I'm understanding what he says right, is that he wants Joe to be worthy of Pip's attention, and therefore, or Pip's society, and then therefore Pip wants to be worthy of Estella's society, so that he won't be ashamed by Joe if Estella ever saw him again. He's trying to make him into a gentleman. Joe is happy being who he is, and that's for him. That's that. So Pip wants to go and visit Miss Havisham again because he wants to see Estella again. Joe tries to discourage him of that. He says, when I was there, she told me don't come back looking for money. And Pip says, well, I'm not going to be looking for money. I just want to go and say hi. Yeah, he wants to go and he wants to go see Estella. In this discussion here, we come across a new character named Orlick. He is a journeyman. It sounds like almost one of Joe's employees at the forge. And I like how he's described on my page 108. I love this quote. He says that he was a broad-shouldered, loose-limbed, swarthy fellow of great strength, never in a hurry and always slouching. He never even seemed to come to his work on purpose, but would slouch in as if by mere accident. And then it goes on to describe how he would slouch his way out of places. And you really get a descriptive idea of what Orlick is like. But I like that idea that he never seemed to come to work on purpose, but it was always it seemed to be an accident. I don't know about you, but I know people like that where they show up not so much because they were scheduled to, but just because it happened to be convenient for them on that particular day. Pip wants some time off so he can go to town to visit Miss Havisham. And then Orlick pops up and says, well, if Pip gets some time off, I want some time off. And if Pip's going to town, then I want to go to town. So Joe, trying to make everyone happy, says, to Orlick, okay, that's fine. You both can have the day off. Let's all take a holiday. Then Mrs. Joe hears this and she loses her mind over this. She says that you must be a rich man, upon my life, to waste wages in that way. I wish I was his master. And then Orlick begins to pick on Mrs. Joe. He's insulting her, he's threatening her, and Joe begins to stick up for her. We see some backbone in Joe. Joe keeps insulting Mrs. Joe. He keeps telling her to leave her alone. Orlick says, I'd hold you if you was my wife. I'd hold you under the pump and choke it out of you. He's threatening her with violence there, and Joe says, I tell you, let her alone, said Joe. Oh, to hear him, cried my sister with a clap of her hands and a scream together, which was her next stage. So she's like antagonizing them, I think. To hear the names he's given me. That Orlick in my house. Me, a married woman, with my husband standing by. Oh, oh, oh. Here my sister, after a fit of clappings and screamings, beat her hands upon her bosom and upon her knees, and threw her cap off and pulled her hair down, which were the last stages on her road to frenzy. Being by this time a perfect fury and a complete success, she made a dash at the door, which I had fortunately locked. So and it turns out then that Joe and Orlick begin to fight, and Joe makes some quick work of him. He's got to be probably the strongest guy in town, and pretty much lays him out. And Mrs. Joe is just kind of losing her mind. Joe picks her up, carries her upstairs, and I guess gets her to calm down. And so Pip goes to go get dressed, probably for dinner or something. But when he comes down, Joe and Orlick are sweeping up and cleaning up, acting as if nothing had happened. And Orlick looks a little worse for wear. So Pip goes to Sada's house again and goes to visit Miss Havisham. And, she says, I hope you want nothing. No, indeed, Miss Havisham. I only wanted you to know that I am doing very well in my apprenticeship and am always much obliged to you. And so then she realizes, hey, are you looking for Estella? And we find out that Estella has gone abroad. Miss Havisham asks, do you feel that you have lost her? There was such a malignant enjoyment in her utterance of the last words, and she broke into such a disagreeable laugh that I was at a loss what to say. So she is gloating over this fact that Pip has finally come back, obviously looking for Estella, and Estella's gone, and Miss Havisham is gloating over that. Continued to be very strange behavior on Miss Havisham's part. Pip begins to loiter around town, and he's imagining all the things he's going to buy once he becomes a gentleman, or if he were to be a gentleman. And then he runs into Mr. Wopsle, who happened to have just bought a play about the tragedy of George Barnwell. And my book, a footnote in my book says that I thought this was interesting, so I'll share what this book or this play was about. It was called The London Merchant, or The History of George Barnwell, by playwright George Lillo, who lived from 1693 to 1739. This tragic drama tells the story of an apprentice who goes astray and ultimately murders his uncle, for which he and his accomplice, Sarah Millwood, are hanged. Written in 1731, the play was popular during Dickens's time and was performed periodically for the moral instruction of apprentices, with the aim of keeping them from Barnwell's fate. So it looks like maybe Mr. Wopsle, what is he doing with his play? Was he thinking about sharing it with Pip? Or what? But it's one of those morality stories, I guess, with the really obvious lesson to teach. So Pip goes home with Mr. Wopsle, and they meet Pumblechook, and they read through the play together. And on their way back, they run into Orlick, who seems to be sneaking around and seems to be lurking. Orlick, they find Orlick, who's sneaking around and seems to be hanging around this on the side of the road. And I like this exchange. It says, "Helloa," we said, stopping. "Orlick there?" "Ah," he answered, slouching out. I was standing by a minute on the chance of company." "You are late," I remarked. Orlick, not unnaturally, answered, "Well, and you're late." "We have been," said Mr. Wopsle, exalted with his late performance, because they were reading the play. "We have been indulging, Mr. Orlick, in an intellectual evening." So Orlick tells them that there was quite the ruckus and commotion going on in town today because some prisoners escaped again from the hulks. So as they make their way back home, they pass the Three Jolly Bargemen, which is, again, the pub, and there's a huge commotion going on there. So they all decide to stop and see what's going on. And what's going on is that there's been a commotion at Pip's house. And Mr. Wopsle tells them, "There's something wrong," said he without stopping. "Up at your place, Pip. Run, all." When he gets there, he finds that his sister had been attacked by nobody knows who. From all appearances at the end of this chapter, I thought when I first read it that she was dead. Let me read it to you and see if you get that same impression. But they get there. His sister is on the floor. The doctor is there. It says his house that it was full of people. The whole village was there, or in the yard, and there was a surgeon, and there was Joe, and there was a group of women, all on the floor in the midst of the kitchen. The unemployed bystanders drew back when they saw me, and so I became aware of my sister, lying without sense or movement on the bare boards where she had been knocked down by a tremendous blow on the back of the head, dealt by some unknown hand when her face was turned towards the fire, destined never to be on the rampage again while she was wife of Joe. So maybe it does show that she was unconscious, but we don't get a lot of detail. We get uncertainty, and that's the end of part 9 that was first published on January 26th in 1861. Now, talk about your cliffhanger. I think this was one of the best cliffhangers that we've had in the story so far. What's happened with Mrs. Joe? Is she okay? Is she going to die? Is she going to recover? I do feel sorry for her here. As wicked as she was, understanding some of her history, some of that can be explained. But did her actions deserve this, to be hit on the head so hard that, as we find in the next 2 chapters, she's been left, she suffered some kind of brain injury so that she's blind and is harder. It impacted her vision, it impacted her hearing, and perhaps some of her mental capacity as well. That's tragic. Did she deserve that? I don't think she did. I don't know. That's the point I'm thinking on right now. That for people who mistreat others, you always hope that they get their just desserts. But this might be a case of, I don't know if she deserved this. Maybe that was too much. But at this point, we don't know who did it, and there are suspicions we find in chapters 16 and 17. Pip, of course, thinks that it was his fault because he has his head full of George Barnwell. Again, the play that they read that talks about the evil apprentice who ended up killing his uncle. And so that story now has given him more of guilt over what happened to his sister, because they find that there was a convict's leg iron in the house, And it's very likely the one that Pip's convict had that Pip now feels guilty about because he helped him escape. He helped him file the leg iron off. And now possibly that leg iron had been used to beat his sister nearly to death. So we have a little bit of a mystery now. Not really a murder mystery, but the mystery of who attacked Pip's sister. Pip says, I believed one or two other persons to have become possessed of it, the leg irons, and to have turned it to this cruel account, either Orlick or the strange man who had shown me the file. As you recall, a couple chapters ago, when Pip was at the Three Jolly Bargemen, they had, that strange man who was there talking with Joe had his convict's file. His thought process is that he feels guilty because he feels like he's provided the murder weapon, that it could have been the strange man who had shown him the file, but his sister would have given him the money back, so there was no reason for him to attack her. He thought it could have been Orlick because he was there with her. There's no clear evidence. And of course, his sister is unable to communicate clearly. We find that her sight was disturbed. Her hearing was greatly impaired, that she tries to communicate through writing, which neither Pip nor Joe are very good at deciphering. But he does say her temper was greatly improved and she was patient. Biddy comes to live with them now and to be to help Joe take care of Mrs. Joe and just to help out the household. So Biddy moves in. She helps them understand what Mrs. Joe was trying to say, that she kept writing this thing that looked like a T on her slate. And Biddy finally realizes she's talking about Orlick, that maybe she wanted Orlick. And so Orlick comes in and Pip thinks that she's going to reveal him as her attacker, but then she seems to be acting very nice and kindly and almost like she's happy to see him. So very, very strange. Pip says that her attitude was that of one that Pip had seen that pervaded the bearing of a child towards a hard master. So the suspicion, I think, right now is on Orlick, and her behavior towards him is very unusual. As he says, it's like a child's behavior towards a hard master. He ends chapter 16 by saying, after that day, a day rarely passed without her drawing the hammer on her slate, and without Orlick's slouching in and standing doggedly before her, as if he knew no more than I did what to make of it. I don't actually remember what's going on with that, so another plot line I don't recall as clearly. So I'm looking forward to seeing what mystery that is that will be unveiled there. But, why does she want Orlick to come into her presence? Was Orlick the one who attacked her? They certainly had an argument, and he certainly had, the means, motive, and opportunity for it. But we'll see what the chapters reveal. So then we get to our final chapter tonight, chapter 17. Pip continues to follow the apprentice life. He occasionally will visit Miss Havisham, but she keeps bringing up how Estella's not there and she's far away. She's going to finishing school, becoming a beautiful young woman, and just, sticking the knife in and twisting it on poor Pip. However, as Pip continues to grow and to live with Joe, and Mrs. Joe and Biddy is now in the household, he says, imperceptibly, I became conscious of a change in Biddy, however. Her shoes came up at the heel, her hair grew bright and neat, her hands were always clean. She was not beautiful, she was common, and could not be like Estella, but she was pleasant and wholesome and sweet-tempered. She had not been with us more than a year. I remember her being newly out of mourning at the time it struck me, when I observed to myself one evening that she had curiously thoughtful and attentive eyes that were very pretty and very good. So this is kind of like a backhanded compliment almost, that she wasn't beautiful, she wasn't like Estella, but, she was all right. Oh, Pip. And this is where I can begin to see what people that have a problem with this book or don't enjoy this book can see Pip's behavior here, that it's he's thinking of himself a lot higher than he should. Is noticed that Biddy is turning out to be a very pleasant young lady. They have this moment where they're talking together, and Pip is just impressed with Biddy and how she's able to do all the household chores and still learn and still teach and do all these things. He wants to confess something to her, and it's not what maybe we were thinking and where this plot was going, but he says that his confession is, I want to be a gentleman. Oh, I wouldn't if I were you, she returned. I don't think it would answer. Biddy, said I with some severity, I have particular reasons for wanting to be a gentleman. You know best, Pip, but don't you think you are happier as you are? Biddy, I exclaimed impatiently, I am not at all happy as I am. I am disgusted with my calling and with my life. I have never taken to either since I was bound. Don't be absurd. Was I absurd? Said Biddy, quietly raising her eyebrows. I am sorry for that. I didn't mean to be. I only want you to do well and be comfortable. Well then, understand once for all that I never shall or can be comfortable or anything but miserable. There, Biddy, unless I can lead a very different sort of life from the life I lead now. That's a pity, said Biddy, shaking her head with a sorrowful air. He's dissatisfied, and Biddy, rightly so, points out, aren't you happier the way you are now? Aren't you happier living here? You're living with Joe. You've got a good job. It's not glamorous. This guy, here's Pip's attempts to try to woo Biddy a little bit. This is just classic teenage boy here. He thinks that if things had continued, if he hadn't been interrupted by Miss Havisham, that he might have grown up to keep company with Biddy. I like this exchange again. He says, you and I and Joe would have wanted nothing then, and Joe and I would perhaps have gone partners when I was out of my time, and I might even have grown up to keep company with you, and we might have sat on this very bank on a fine Sunday, quite different people. I should have been good enough for you, shouldn't I, Biddy? Biddy sighed as she looked at the ships sailing on and returned for answer, Yes, I am not over particular. It scarcely sounded flattering, but I knew she meant well. And so now then he complains like, well, now look at my life. I'm dissatisfied. I'm uncomfortable. He says, see how I am going on, dissatisfied and uncomfortable. And what would it signify to me, being coarse and common, if nobody had told me so? Biddy turned her face towards mine and looked far more attentively at me than she had looked at the sailing ships. It was neither a very true nor a very polite thing to say, she remarked, directing her eyes to the ships again. Who said it? And he answers her, the beautiful young lady at Miss Havisham's. And she's more beautiful than anybody ever was, and I admire her dreadfully, and I want to be a gentleman on her account. Having made this lunatic confession, I began to throw my torn-up grass into the river, as if I had some thoughts of following it. Do you want to be a gentleman to spite her, or to gain her over? Biddy quietly asked me after a pause. I don't know, I moodily answered. Because if it is to spite her, Biddy pursued, I should think, but you know best, that might be better and more independently done by caring nothing for her words. And if it is to gain her over, I should think, but you know best, she was not worth gaining over. And he tells her that it might all be true, but I admire her dreadfully. What's the deal here, Pip? Okay, Biddy's dropping truth bombs on you, and you're just ignoring them. So she asks, do you want to be a gentleman to spite her or to gain her over? And he says, honestly, he doesn't know. And she tells him that if you want to become a gentleman to spite her, the best thing you can do is just ignore the insults that she's hurled at you. But if you want to do it to gain her over, she says she is not worth gaining over. She has treated you cruelly and with contempt. Why? Why do you want her? I can't help but think, in Pip's mind, that if I'm a gentleman, I need a beautiful wife. Maybe he's looking at Estella more as an object than as a person. And that, when we, men, when we view women that way, that's not good. And I wonder if maybe he's not doing some of that in his mind here, that he's thinking, she is something I need to possess because then I'll be a gentleman. And if I can earn her respect and get her not to say the things about me that she said and show her that I am better than what she thinks, I admire his desire to pull himself up out of the gutter but he's doing it at the cost of his character. And that's never a good thing. So as they continue on their conversation, Pip continues to be the most awkward guy I've ever had the experience of knowing, I think, and says classic lines such as, "If I could only get myself to fall in love with you. You don't mind me speaking so openly to such an old acquaintance." "Oh dear, not at all," said Biddy. "Don't mind me." I can't help but read that a little sarcastically. "If I could only get myself to do it, that would be the thing for me. But you never will, you see," said Biddy. I feel for Biddy. I think she liked Pip. And Pip is just, he's ignoring her. He's saying, boy, if I was stuck here, I guess you and I would end up getting married. And maybe if I could force myself to love you, then things will get better. You'll rescue me from this funk I'm in. I hope you're seeing all kinds of warning signs going up now, that, hey, there's something not right here. This is not good. This is not healthy behavior. There's a problem here. On the way home, they run into Orlick again, and he acts very creepy and gross towards Estella. Is super uncomfortable around Orlick. She's, he flirts around with her and she doesn't like it. And Pip decides to do a good thing here. And he says, "I kept an eye on Orlick after that night. And whenever circumstances were favorable to his dancing at Biddy, got before him to obscure that demonstration. He had struck root in Joe's establishment by reason of my sister's sudden fancy for him, or I should have tried to get him dismissed. He quite understood and reciprocated my good intentions, as I had reason to know thereafter." And so we close out this part as Pip contemplates where his life is right now. He says, "And now, because my mind was not confused enough before, I complicated its confusion 50,000-fold by having states and seasons when I was clear that Biddy was immeasurably better than Estella, and that the plain, honest working life to which I was born had nothing in it to be ashamed of, but offered me sufficient means of self-respect and happiness." Okay, good. Those are good thoughts. Let's run with that. But he goes on, he says, "At those times, I would decide conclusively that my disaffection to dear old Joe and the forge was gone, and that I was growing up in a fair way to be partners with Joe and to keep company with Biddy," which means like being dating or courtship, "when, all in a moment, some confounding remembrance of the Havisham days would fall upon me like a destructive missile and scatter my wits again. Scattered wits take a long time picking up, and often, before I had got them well together, they would be dispersed in all directions by one stray thought that perhaps, after all, Miss Havisham was going to make my fortune when my time was out. If my time had run out, it would have left me still at the height of my perplexities, I dare say. It never did run out, however, but was brought to a premature end, as I proceed to relate." And end of chapter 17, end of part 10, published February 2nd in 1861. So we get another cliffhanger. What is Pip talking about? It says, "In the process of my apprenticeship, I began to think, maybe Biddy wasn't so bad, and maybe the forge isn't so bad." And, that influence of wickedness begins to wear off on him. But then he suddenly remembers his time at Miss Havisham's house and the words that Estella used on him, and it would just make his brain explode like a destructive missile, which is not a phrase I would have expected to find in a Victorian novel, but I guess they did have cannonballs and things like that would have been like a destructive missile. I don't know. He was holding out hope that by the time his apprenticeship ended, Miss Havisham would give him a fortune, would make his fortune. He said, "If my time had run out, if my apprenticeship had been brought to a completion, it would have left me still at the height of my perplexities." I dare say, he says, even by the time of my apprenticeship was done, nothing would have changed. I'd still be having the perplexities in my head. I'd still be longing for that fortune, wanting to become a gentleman, struggling over his feelings for Estella. However, he says, "I never found out. Because my apprenticeship did not run out, it was ended prematurely." Now, why and how it ended prematurely? Well, that's for us to find out in the next chapters. So we'll have to wait a week to see what happens, what is to come for Pip that causes his apprenticeship to be to be brought up short. So just a couple things here to wrap up. I've left you some thoughts and questions along the way in the video, but also, I find Pip's behavior to be very unpleasant in these chapters. What gives me hope to keep reading is older Pip is looking back and in some instances calls out his younger self saying, yeah, this was unpleasant. And this thing I'm ashamed of, that it's causing him discomfort. As well it should, because his behavior is just rotten. What I learned from this is be content with the simple life. How did he put it? He had a job that it offered him sufficient means of self-respect and happiness. And what more could you ask for? You couldn't ask for a better place to work. Why is he so obsessed with spending time with people who will only insult him and hurt him? Boy, there might be something to that now that I think about it. I'm not a psychologist at all, but I wonder if the way his sister treats him caused him to seek that out in relationships too. That, I got to find someone who hurts me and be with them because that's what I'm used to. I don't know. I don't know if that's even a thing. I expect it probably is, unfortunately. What happened to his sister, who attacked her, was a devastating moment in this book, a very, very hard moment to read as well. So that brings us to the end of our discussion on this book and these chapters. Next week, I believe we are looking at only chapters 18 and 19. But check the show notes below just to be sure on that one. I think there'll be longer chapters, and we're going to have a lot of things to cover there. I will be reaching out in the Voxer channel this week to see if anyone wants to join me for next week's discussion. I'll leave a chat there in the Voxer channel. So if you're interested, let me know. Or if you're not caught up yet and you want to be in one coming up, we can do that. Just we'll just plan for it. So thanks again for watching. Thanks for listening if you're on the podcast side. And until next time, happy reading. Take care.